The HOA redrew my property line overnight, and somehow my name vanished from the deed. I came back to my father's lake cabin and found a stranger on my porch swing, calling it his. Turns out his mom, the HOA president, had reassigned my land to her own son. I didn't argue. I built a fence, but they picked the wrong man to erase, because when they tried to redraw my boundaries, I fenced their entire office into mine. The gravel road to the lake has a way of quieting a man before he arrives. Pines lean in, needles whispering over the hood of my old pickup, and water flashes through gaps in the trees. Silver, then dark, then silver again. I rolled the window down to let the resin and clean damp drift in. Montana mornings have a bite to them. I had been gone 6 months, my sister's surgery, a couch that wasn't mine, a duffel half-zipped. Every mile back toward the cabin loosened a knot I'd carried since winter. The place sits low by a cove where the wind dies and the loons talk like neighbors. My father staked those footings himself, back when a handshake outlasted paper. I turned the last bend and braked. The porch swing was moving. Not from wind, moving because a bare foot pushed it. Slow arcs that creaked the chain in a rhythm I knew by heart. A glass of iced tea sweated onto the armrest I carved the summer I turned 19. A shirtless man lounged there as if he'd grown up with that view. Bluetooth earpiece, plastic flip-flops, the swing he owned with a heel. I killed the engine. The sudden quiet made the bees in the fireweed sound loud. He didn't turn. He took another sip, then finally tipped his head like he'd remembered he owned a dog he hadn't fed. "Morning," I said, stepping out. The gravel popped under my boots. "Can I help you?" He looked over mirrored lenses and smiled, easy as spilled oil. "You must be the neighbor. I'm Travis. This is my place now." The words staggered in, bumped into each other, then lined up with a click. My place. He took the earpiece out like he was about to offer directions. HOA president reassigned it. Previous owner abandoned it. Paperwork's clean. I stared at the swing chain rubbed bright by years of hands. My father and I hung that swing on a dirt-warm afternoon after setting the last cedar plank. I bled on that armrest when the chisel slipped. The stain was there if you knew where to look. A brown ghost in the grain. "You're Travis Whitfield?" I asked. He stood, slow, not a hint of apology. "That's right. Your mother is Bethany." "President Whitfield," he said, smiling wider. "We're bringing consistency to the shoreline. Values, safety, cohesion. This was listed as unmaintained." "Unmaintained," I repeated. The gutter spout I hammered true last spring glinted in the sun. The padlock on the tool shed still carried my thumbprint in a run of varnish I'd never sanded smooth. In the gravel by the steps, my father's old boot-print mold cupped a crescent of rainwater. A John boat knocked softly against the dock. Loons answered in the cove. My hands stayed at my sides. "I'll need you off that swing," I said. "Now!" His chuckle slid across the porch like a wet leaf. "Look, neighbor, Jake, right? I'm not here to fight. We did the process. Mom handled the documents. Board signed off. You were gone, it's unfortunate." Paper had convinced him this cabin was a change of mailing address. I nodded like a man learning the weather. "You done with that tea?" He glanced at the glass, then back. "Help yourself. Plenty more inside." Inside. The word put a spark under my ribs. The screen door latch was flipped. The brass deadbolt was vertical like a soldier at attention. A faint line of sawdust caught the light along the threshold. My shop smell, not his. He'd been inside. "We'll sort it out," Travis said, palming his earpiece. "No hard feelings." I walked down the steps I'd planed true with a block my father left me, crossed the yard and climbed into my truck. The seat springs sighed. The key turned with the same coarse click as always. "Hey," he called. "Where you going?" I rolled the window down. The lake came in, cold stone, sun on water. 2 blocks, promotion, to check on some paperwork. Paperwork, he repeated, amused. Make sure you talk to Mom. I didn't drive far, just to the HOA office, a glass-fronted box pretending to be neutral. It sat in a square of manicured petunias and imported rock. Through the glass, a corkboard was crowded with notices, fence height clarifications, kayak color palettes, fines due. On the seat beside me, a leather folio held my life in paper. Deed, permits, photographs that yellowed only at the edges. The deed was smooth from my father's hands and mine. Witness names, book and page. The line that described from the big pine to the granite outcrop to the waterline as historically surveyed. I flattened the deed across the wheel. The seal caught the sun and burned a small star onto my palm. Behind the hedge, a sprinkler ticked, soft metronome of a system insisting it was in control. Bethany's voice carried from inside, the practiced brightness of someone never surprised. I closed the folio and slid it under the seat. Not today. No raised voices under fluorescent light. I'd built spillways that moved a river without calling attention to themselves. There were better ways to move what needed moving. I called a number I hadn't used in months. "Sarah," I said when she picked up. "I'm back at the lake. They've reassigned my cabin." A beat. "By what authority?" "By paper that smells like fresh toner." She exhaled. "Come by this afternoon. Bring the deed and any correspondence. I'll pull the recorder books and the plats. And Jake, don't touch him. Don't touch anything." "I won't." A breeze lifted the flyer on the door. With the window down, I could hear the lake, the easy lap under the dock, the cable strumming as the boat bumped and settled. I could also hear, in the quiet part of my mind, the slow thump of a post driver, steel finding dirt, dirt taking steel. Boundaries you didn't have to argue about, because they stood there and rang in the wind. I looked at my hands. More map than tool now, lines crossing where work insisted. They still remembered measurements. They still remembered what had to be true, even when a clipboard said otherwise. The sun threw a quilt of light through the pines onto the hood. A printer chirred inside the office. Across the lot, a delivery truck eased up with pallets of ornamental fencing strapped tight, black and brochure perfect. "You can test ownership on paper," I said, though no one could hear. I eased the truck into reverse and rolled back onto the road along the water. In the mirror, the glass office wore a square of the lake like a badge. The wind shifted. A loon called. The swing creaked again in my head. "If they want to test ownership," I said, settling my palm on the wheel as the truck nosed toward home, "I'll draw the line myself." The county road unspooled before me like an old survey line, cracked, stubborn, and full of stories nobody bothered to read anymore. The lake glimmered in the mirror, quiet as if nothing had happened. But my pulse was still hammering from the porch scene, a stranger on my swing. My name signed on a deed I didn't touch. The HOA office squatted at the end of Pine Ridge Drive, a sterile box pretending to belong beside mountains older than time. Through the glass I could already see her, Bethany Whitfield, every inch the queen of her own little empire. Blazer too sharp for a lake town, nails red as warning lights, smile practiced in mirrors that never talked back. She looked up as I walked in. "Mr. Morrison, you're back earlier than expected." Her tone was honey poured over gravel. "Didn't know I was expected," I said, setting my hat on the counter. Bethany turned a clipboard toward me. "We were just finalizing reassignment paperwork for Lot 42A. Travis mentioned you might stop by." "Reassignment," I repeated, the word foreign in my mouth. She tapped a map spread across the desk. "See? The northern parcels were merged for administrative efficiency. Your cabin fell under the new lot line. I leaned closer. The ink shimmered black and fresh. Even the coffee ring beside it was still damp. My father's property was filed separately, I said quietly. Lot 41B since 1982. You'll find it in the registry under Morrison Holdings. Bethany's smile didn't budge. Oh, we updated those outdated deeds. The board approved the changes unanimously. We had to. Maintenance, taxes, the usual. She slid the papers closer like a magician, inviting the audience to admire the trick. Funny, I murmured, running my thumb along the signature line. Looks like my name. Just cleaner, straighter. Her lashes flicked up. We use digital records. Sometimes the font doesn't bleed ink at the corners. I finished for her. The room went still. Even the wall clock seemed to hesitate between seconds. I took a slow breath. The smell of toner and lake air clashed in the back of my throat. My father used to say you can tell when land's been stolen. The air feels too polished, too new. Bethany reached for a manila folder, but I was already turning to leave. You'll receive official notice soon, she called after me. Maybe, I said, pushing the door open. Maybe you will too. Outside, the sun hit the water like a hammer striking silver. I drove home in silence, gravel spitting beneath the tires. Inside the glove box lay the old deed, creases like river channels, signature faded to ghost gray ink. My father's handwriting looped and bent across the page, stubborn as the man himself. Back at the cabin, the porch swing still swayed slightly, slow as breath. The glass Travis had used sat on the railing, a ring of melted ice circling the bottom. I picked it up, tossed it into the bin, and pulled out the battered file box I'd kept under the bed since Dad passed. Receipts, tax slips, Polaroids of the cabin's frame rising out of cedar beams. At the very bottom, the original deed, notarized, embossed, and sealed in dust. I sat at the kitchen table, light cutting through the blinds in narrow golden bars, and whispered the same words I'd heard 100 times growing up. Paper doesn't own land. People do. The phone on the counter buzzed. One name, Sarah Coleman. Jake, she said the moment I answered, voice tight with caffeine and law degrees. I pulled your county file like you asked. There's a quitclaim deed filed in your name from 2 months ago. Let me guess, I said. I sold my own property while I was out of state. Exactly. But whoever did it, they were sloppy. They used an old template. The notary stamp expired 5 years ago. So it's fraud. It's more than that, Sarah replied. It's intent. And if Bethany's fingerprints are anywhere on those documents, she's in serious trouble. The words hit like cold rain. Fraud. Intent. Trouble. I looked out through the window at the line of pines marking the edge of my land, the same line Dad and I marked with iron stakes 30 years ago. The stakes were still there, half buried in moss, holding their ground better than most people I knew. I'll need everything, Sarah said. Original deed, tax receipts, photos, and Jake, don't engage them. Let the evidence do the talking. I hung up, fingers trembling just enough to make the old paper rustle. The lake outside was calm, but beneath the surface something darker moved. Quiet, patient, waiting. I folded the deed carefully and slid it into a waterproof sleeve, sealing it like a secret. The ink still smelled faintly of the past, iron, salt, and pine smoke. They forged the wrong man's name, I whispered, and the cabin seemed to agree, the walls creaking softly in the cooling air. Somewhere beyond the trees, a crow called once, sharp and final. I folded the deed carefully and slid it into a waterproof sleeve, sealing it like a secret. The ink still smelled faintly of the past, iron, salt, and pine smoke. They forged the wrong man's name, I whispered, and the cabin seemed to agree, the walls creaking softly in the cooling air. Somewhere beyond the trees, a crow called once, sharp and final. By morning, the air over the lake had turned to glass. Mist hovered just above the waterline, gray ribbons twisting through the pines. I brewed a pot of black coffee and stood on the porch watching sunlight crawl down the slope. There was something about that stillness that made decisions clearer. At 9:00 a.m., a delivery truck rumbled down the gravel path, breaking the calm. Two men in overalls jumped out, stretching their backs from the long drive. The side of the truck read Gallatin Fencing and Supply in fading blue paint. "You Jake Morrison?" the driver called. I nodded. "Got 24 steel posts, 2 pallets of cement, and a spool of black chain link. Says rush delivery." "That's me." The driver whistled low. "That's a serious amount of fence, mister." I smiled without humor. Serious problem needs a serious line. We unloaded everything in the clearing behind the cabin, the thump of each post landing like punctuation. The men didn't ask questions. They'd seen enough feuds over property lines to know when not to. When the truck finally rolled away, dust trailed off toward the highway, leaving me alone with the hum of cicadas and the smell of iron. I took my father's old tape measure from the toolbox and walked to the edge of the property. The first stake was right where we'd set it decades ago, half swallowed by moss, still loyal. I knelt, pressed my palm to the cool soil, and whispered, "We start here, old man." The work began slow, measuring, marking, digging. By noon, sweat dripped down my back, the sun baking the smell of cement and dirt into my skin. Each hole was a statement. Each post that slid into the ground carried the weight of a promise. When the auger's engine roared to life, its echo bounced across the valley. Birds scattered from the trees, and somewhere down the road, a door slammed. I didn't look up. The rhythm of the machine drowned everything else out. The grind, the bite, the solid thunk as steel met clay. By mid-afternoon, the first section of fence stood gleaming under the light. It caught the sun like a black river, straight and true, running from the cabin's back edge toward the main road. I kept going, driving the line farther, marking a path that led directly toward the HOA office that squatted 2 blocks away. When I stopped for water, the world had gone quiet again, except for the metallic ping of cooling steel. A breeze drifted in from the lake, carrying the scent of pine sap and mud. I thought about my father, how he used to tell me that boundaries weren't about keeping people out. They were about reminding folks where respect began. The next sound I heard wasn't the wind. "Mr. Morrison!" I turned. Bethany Whitfield stood by her Lexus, heels sinking into the soft dirt, face redder than her nails. Her voice cut through the air like a saw. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I set down the hammer, wiped my hands on my jeans. "Building a fence. You can't just—" She gestured toward the line of posts. "Block community access. This road belongs to the HOA." "Does it?" I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the certified survey from the county office. "Because according to this, everything from that pine tree to your office parking lot sits on my deed." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I walked closer, holding the paper between us. "You redrew lines on a map, Bethany. I'm redrawing them on the ground." Her expression hardened. "This is harassment. This," I said, tapping the nearest post, "is steel." She looked past me to the growing wall of black metal and concrete, her jaw tightening. Behind her, Travis had appeared, slouching beside the car with his sunglasses pushed up in his hair. He looked less confident than before, like a man realizing his mother might have gone too far. "You'll regret this, Mr. Morrison," Bethany hissed. "Maybe," I said, lifting the hammer again, "but not today." The next strike echoed across the lake. Clang, clang, clang. each hit marking another inch reclaimed. Bethany's car door slammed, and her engine roared to life, spitting gravel as she sped away. I worked until the sun began to bleed into the water, painting everything in gold and rust. The fence stretched behind me now, solid and defiant, slicing through the weeds and dust straight to the HOA office wall. When I finally stopped, I stood at the last post and looked down the line. It wasn't perfect. Some posts leaned, the cement hadn't cured, but it was there. A boundary you could see, touch, and feel humming under the evening air. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Somewhere near the office, I saw movement behind the tinted windows, silhouettes watching, waiting. I smiled and tipped my hat toward them. "I'm fencing in what's mine," I said to no one in particular. As the last light faded, I caught a flash on the ridge. A black SUV, headlights off, parked just far enough to stay hidden. Someone was watching. I let the silence settle over the property like a blanket and walked back toward the cabin. The sound of the auger still rang faintly in my ears, a promise hammered into the soil. By the time I reached the porch, the sun had slipped behind the ridge, leaving the lake the color of tarnished silver. Crickets had begun their night shift, and the air smelled of wet pine and cooling metal. I sat on the steps with a thermos of coffee and watched the fence stretch like a shadow down to the road. Steady, straight, undeniable. I should have felt at peace. Instead, I felt watched. Headlights flickered once at the edge of the property, cutting across the new posts. A black SUV idled for a moment, before rolling slowly away. No plates I could read. No sound, but the crunch of gravel. At 8 the next morning, I heard another engine. A sedan this time. White, polished, city plates. The man who stepped out looked like he'd been printed from a government catalog. Sunglasses, black tie, clipboard tucked under one arm. He walked up the path like he owned the air. "Mr. Morrison?" "That's me," I said. He nodded once. "Mr. Snipe, representing the Lakeview HOA on behalf of President Whitfield. I'm here to deliver a cease and desist notice." He held out a manila envelope like it was radioactive. The seal gleamed. I didn't take it. "You can set it there," I said, pointing to the porch railing. He placed it carefully, straightened it as if that mattered, then turned toward the lake. "You're in violation of Section 4B, Subdivision Ordinance 12, obstruction of access to common grounds. You'll need to remove that fence immediately." "Is that right?" "Indeed." He smiled thinly. "You have 48 hours. Before I could answer, a voice burst out from behind the cabin. "You can't take this place!" It was Travis Whitfield, storming out of the shadows, half-dressed and furious. His hair stuck up like he'd been sleeping off a hangover. Snipe blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" Travis pointed at me. "He's lying. My mom said this is my cabin. She signed it over." Snipe turned, his expression tightening. "Mr. Whitfield, I wasn't aware you were residing here." Travis froze, realizing what he'd said. It's just temporary." I crossed my arms. "You just told him your mother signed it over. Not exactly how property law works, son." Snipe's head turned sharply toward me. "You have evidence of ownership?" "More than you want to see," I said, picking up the envelope and handing it back. "And next time you deliver threats, make sure your witness isn't confessing to fraud in front of you." He didn't take it. His jaw flexed. "You'll regret ignoring this, Mr. Morrison." "Maybe," I said evenly, "but not before someone else does." Travis's eyes darted between us, panic surfacing under his tan. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Snipe adjusted his tie, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car. The sedan's tires kicked up a soft spray of dust as it pulled away, leaving the two of us standing in the quiet. Travis rubbed the back of his neck. Look, I didn't mean— You meant exactly what you said, I interrupted. Now you'd better tell your mother that her legal messenger just heard her son admit to knowing this property isn't his. He looked pale. I wouldn't have to. He already did. He stared at me for a moment longer, then stalked off toward the road, his sandals slapping the dirt. I watched him go until the trees swallowed him. Inside the cabin, I brewed another pot of coffee, the kind that could wake the dead, and sat at my father's old desk. The papers were spread out like a battle map, the original deed, the forged one Sarah had scanned and sent over email, and the letter from the HOA threatening me for building on shared land. Shared. That word burned hotter than any insult. I turned on my laptop, the fan whining as the screen flickered to life. There was a new email from Sarah. Found something. County registry shows multiple quitclaim filings over the last year, all notarized by the same person. Name's a ghost. License expired in 2018. I read it twice. Then a third time. Someone had built a little paper empire out of fake signatures and stale ink, and Bethany Whitfield was at the top of it. The afternoon light slid across the floor, warm and sharp as a blade. I could almost hear my father's voice again. Calm, steady, the way he sounded when fixing the dam turbines in spring runoff. Measure twice, cut once, but make sure you're cutting the right thing. I spent the rest of the day cataloging everything: photographs of the fence line, time-stamped receipts, screenshots of the emails. When you can't outshout someone, out-document them. By dusk, I stepped outside. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of sawdust and lake water. Across the ridge, storm clouds piled high like slow-moving mountains. I could feel something shifting, something in the air, in the town, in the way the crows had gone silent. My phone buzzed again. Sarah's name. Jake, I just got off the phone with the clerk's office. Oh, she said. The HOA filed another amendment this morning, trying to rename your parcel number entirely. They're erasing it on paper. They'll have to erase me first, I said. Jake, listen, she warned. This isn't a simple civil issue anymore. It's criminal. Do nothing until I drive up there. Understood? I hesitated, looking down the line of fence posts glinting under the setting sun. They looked like sentinels. Understood, I said. But if they start drawing lines, I'll finish them. After the call, I sat on the porch, feeling the day settle into the soil. The black SUV from the ridge appeared again, closer this time, headlights cutting through the trees before switching off. A window rolled down, and I could just make out a flash of a camera lens reflecting the twilight. Then the engine revved, and the vehicle backed into the dark. The first drops of rain began to fall, soft, deliberate, steady. In the distance, thunder rolled, low and patient, like something old waking up. By the time I got inside, the rain had turned the world to glass. The cabin windows quivered with wind, and the lake outside flickered with streaks of lightning. I made another pot of coffee, sat at my father's old drafting table, and waited for Sarah's headlights to appear on the road. They came just before 9, a muted glow sliding across the wet gravel. She stepped out, rain slicker flapping, her brown hair pulled into a tight knot. You picked one hell of a storm to start a war, she said, brushing water from her sleeves. Not my choice, I replied, handing her a mug. They drew first blood, on paper. She spread a folder across the table, water dripping from her jacket onto the wood. You're right about the forgery. Same signature style, same notary stamp. Expired, duplicated, and copied across 4 other properties. 4? She nodded, her expression hard. All along the northern shore. Yours is just the first. The others belong to older residents, folks who don't check their mail too often. One already has an eviction notice pinned to their porch. Lightning cracked outside, lighting the room in blue-white flashes. For a second, Sarah's face looked carved from stone. I exhaled slowly. She's not just moving fences. She's moving people. Exactly, Sarah said. Bethany's building a paper trail to legitimize it. If we don't stop her soon, she'll claim these cabins as abandoned parcels under HOA domain. Once that happens, they'll sell them off to developers. The word hit like thunder. Developers. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flickering lamplight. Dad used to say there's no faster way to kill a lake than to put a gate in front of it. Sarah flipped through the files, her tone quiet but firm. You're going to need evidence beyond the deed. We'll hit them with public records, meeting minutes, payment transfers, bank ledgers. I'll draft subpoenas for those under the Sunshine Law. Outside, wind slammed against the porch door. Somewhere out on the lake, I could hear the hollow creak of my dock ropes straining. Sarah gathered her papers. Meet me in town tomorrow. There's someone you should talk to, a retired surveyor named Ray Delgado. He worked for the county for 30 years, knows every shoreline inch by inch. I walked her to the truck, rain pinging off the hood. You think he'll talk? She smiled faintly. Ray doesn't like corruption. Or Bethany. After she left, I stood on the porch long after the taillights disappeared. The storm eased, leaving only the hiss of dripping eaves and the faint groan of trees. I turned the porch light off, but the fence gleamed under the weak glow of lightning, like a spine running down the land. Morning came gray and cold. The lake steamed faintly, a ghost of itself. I drove into town, windshield wipers beating time to my thoughts. Ray Delgado's shop sat at the edge of Main Street, a squat building with peeling paint and a sign that read Survey and Supply. Inside smelled of sawdust and engine oil. Maps of the county lined every wall, layered like old bark. Ray himself was behind the counter, white beard tangled, eyes sharp as survey pins. Sarah said you'd be coming, he said without looking up. You're the man they tried to erase. I gave a dry chuckle. Seems that way. He reached under the counter and slid out a cardboard tube. This, he said, unrolling it on the counter, is the official survey from 1982. Original topography. See these dotted lines? Natural boundary markers. Trees, rock, waterline. He jabbed a thick finger at one corner. That's your land. Lake elevation fixed at 4,213 feet. The HOA's redraw shows 4,206, 7 feet lower. You know what that means? They shifted the shoreline. Exactly. Moved the lake line south to make your property look like it sits on communal land. They can't do that without a state hydrology review. My chest tightened. And if they did? Then you've got a fraud case with teeth, Ray said. Big teeth. I left his office with the old map rolled under my arm like a weapon. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, sunlight spilling through in fractured beams. It lit the courthouse roof like a promise. Back at the cabin, I pinned the map next to the new blueprints Bethany's office had mailed me weeks ago. The difference was plain as daylight. Her version bent the shoreline like a snake, curling just enough to swallow my boathouse and part of the driveway. I took photos, labeled everything, and sent copies to Sarah. Her reply came quick. Perfect. We'll use this to challenge their jurisdiction. Don't confront them yet. Let me set up the filing. But patience has never been my gift. Late that afternoon, a white SUV rolled up to my gate. Bethany climbed out, sunglasses flashing like armor. Behind her was a man in a suit holding a briefcase. Preston Hale, the local developer. I recognized his name from billboards promising luxury lakefront living coming soon. She waved at me with mock politeness. Mr. Morrison, I hope you're enjoying your little construction project. We have a proposition. I walked closer, mud clinging to my boots. Last time you made a proposition, it came with forged documents. Her smile didn't falter. You can't fight progress forever. Hale Development is prepared to offer a buyout, 3 times your property's appraised value. And what happens to the rest of the lake? I asked. Preston adjusted his tie. Renovation, recreation, access for the public. Access, I repeated. You mean control? Bethany's tone turned icy. You can stand with us, or you can be replaced by zoning order. I stared at her for a long moment, rainwater still dripping from the eaves onto the fresh cement of my fence posts. I'll take the third option. She blinked. Which is? Truth, I said. And it doesn't sell. Their smiles cracked, just slightly. The SUV door slammed, and the tires spat gravel all the way down the road. When the noise faded, I stood alone by the fence, holding the rolled map like a flagstaff. The sky was clearing again, but the air had that heavy calm before another storm, the kind that doesn't come from weather. I walked back inside and spread the maps side by side, old against new, honest against false. The difference was unmistakable. If the law wouldn't move fast enough, I'd move it myself. The idea came to me as the evening fog crept over the lake, a quiet sort of rebellion. Bethany and her board liked to operate behind closed doors, twisting ink into ownership. Maybe it was time to open the doors, let the sunlight in. The next morning, I printed copies of both maps and the surveyor's notes. I added photos of the forged deeds, the notary stamps, and that meeting agenda Sarah had unearthed, the one where they'd voted to reassign abandoned parcels. Every sheet went into a manila envelope marked Lake Justice. Then I wrote 6 words on a stack of handbills. Potluck by the lake, Saturday at dusk. I drove through the community, leaving them in mailboxes, under porch mats, and taped to boathouse doors. No speeches, no signatures, no protests. Just food, fellowship, and truth. By Saturday, the lake felt different. Still, but listening. The air smelled of cedar smoke and slow-cooked ribs. Families brought folding tables, pies, lawn chairs. Children chased each other through the grass while old-timers swapped fishing tails that predated the HOA's existence. I stood at the back for a long time, watching. It reminded me of the summers when my father hosted fish fries. No rules, no committees, just people who understood that land and water meant responsibility, not leverage. When the sun started dropping behind the pines, I walked to the center of the crowd. The murmur quieted. Evening, folks, I began. I wasn't planning on speaking tonight, but there's something you all need to see. I laid the 2 maps on the picnic table, one yellowed with age, the other crisp and white. This, I said, tapping the old one, is the survey filed by the county in 1982. This other one came from the HOA office 2 months ago. The difference was glaring. Shorelines warped, boundary numbers changed, and the HOA logo stamped in bold at the bottom. A ripple of voices ran through the crowd. Is that legal? Someone asked. Not even close, Sarah's voice answered from behind me. She had just arrived, briefcase in hand. We've confirmed multiple forged signatures, including Jake's. If these lines stand, half the lakefront properties will be absorbed by the HOA and sold to developers. Gasps. A man in a fishing cap shook his head. They can't do that. They already started, I said. Mine was first. I handed copies of the documents to the people nearest me. Pages passed hand to hand like a quiet current. Each set of eyes that scanned them grew darker with disbelief. Bethany showed up halfway through. I saw her reflection in the lake before I heard her heels on the gravel. She stood at the edge of the group, arms crossed, a brittle smile carved into her face. Mr. Morrison, she said, raising her voice, this gathering is unauthorized. You're distributing false materials and defaming the HOA. False? I stepped aside so the crowd could see her clearly. Then you won't mind explaining these. I held up the survey copies. 2 maps, same parcels, same signatures, except one has your initials on the bottom corner. Her face didn't flinch, but the silence did. A man from Lot 7 spoke first. Bethany, you fined me last year for cutting down a dead pine. Said it was protected. But your new map shows that tree on your property. Another neighbor chimed in. She made me repaint my dock because the color wasn't HOA approved. Mine too, a woman added. The murmuring grew louder, circling her like the tightening ring of water around a dropped stone. Bethany raised her hand, voice sharp. This is slander. No, Sarah said calmly. This is evidence. She opened her briefcase, pulling out notarized copies of the documents. And I'll be submitting them to the county clerk on Monday. Bethany's eyes darted around, looking for control she no longer had. You're all being misled. This man, she pointed at me, is angry because he lost his property. I smiled, slow and steady. You're right about one thing, Bethany. I am angry. Not because I lost it, because you tried to steal it. Someone clapped. Then another. Within seconds, the applause rolled like thunder, echoing off the water. Bethany's jaw tightened. Her hands trembled despite the smile she tried to hold. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the HOA building up the road, her assistant hustling after her. The crowd watched her go until her silhouette disappeared behind the fence line. The air seemed to breathe again. Conversations flared, people trading stories, realizing how deep the rot had gone. I moved to the edge of the lake, feeling the weight lift, if only for a moment. Sarah joined me, her eyes reflecting the firelight from the grills. You did good tonight, she said. It's not over, I replied. She'll hit back. She will, Sarah agreed. But now you've got witnesses, and unity. I stared across the water at the faint lights of the HOA office, glowing behind the trees. Funny thing about power, I said. It always thinks silence equals consent. She smiled faintly. And you just broke the silence. The wind picked up then, scattering a few napkins and carrying the smell of smoke over the lake. For the first time in months, laughter rose from the shoreline. Real laughter. Unguarded, the kind that comes when fear loosens its grip. The night ended with neighbors lingering by lantern light, promising to stand together. Some offered to testify, others to bring old paperwork and photos. Unity had started with food and truth, but as the crowd dispersed and the last pickup truck rolled away, I noticed a faint glow flickering across the lake's far shore. Orange, unsteady, wrong. I narrowed my eyes. It wasn't the reflection of lanterns. Flames were licking up from the edge of my boathouse roof. The air caught in my throat. For a split second, I froze, every instinct fighting between disbelief and rage. Then my boots were moving before my mind caught up. I tore down the slope, the wet grass slick underfoot, my heart hammering with every step. The lake wind carried the smell before I reached the dock. Gasoline and burning pitch. It wasn't an accident. Someone had poured fire where the water should have been enough to keep it safe. Hey! I shouted into the night. But the only answer was the crackle of flames and the popping of nails as the boards gave way. I grabbed a bucket, filled it from the lake, and tossed it onto the side of the building. Steam hissed and rose, the water useless against the fury. The roof caved inward with a hollow groan. Sparks drifted upward, catching in the pines like dying stars. Headlights bounced across the hill behind me, neighbors coming back. Someone yelled to call the fire department. Within minutes, sirens wailed from the highway, growing louder until red lights painted the trees. The firefighters worked fast, but the old boathouse didn't stand a chance. The place my father had built board by board with his own hands went up in a storm of sparks and smoke. When it was over, only a blackened skeleton stood above the waterline. One of the firemen handed me what was left of a picture frame. Charred, warped, the glass melted to one corner. Inside, barely visible beneath the soot, was the faded image of my dad holding me on his shoulders by this very dock. I didn't say a word. The world had gone too quiet for words. By sunrise, the lake smelled of ash and wet wood. Neighbors offered condolences in hushed voices, but all I could do was stare at the ruins. Every piece of timber, every nail, it was like watching a memory drown. Sheriff McKay arrived mid-morning, his cruiser crunching over the gravel. He was a tall man with kind eyes, the kind that had seen too much but still believed in the law. "Jake," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Heard you had a long night." "Someone said it," I said flatly. He nodded. "That's what it looks like. Gasoline residue in the debris. Not your typical electrical fire." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket. "Got any enemies lately?" I gave a dry laugh. "How much time you got?" He smirked. "HOA trouble?" "Worse. Paper thieves." McKay sighed and glanced at the blackened remains. "You think they're connected?" "I don't think," I said. "I know." He scratched his beard, thoughtful. "You realize if I open an arson case tied to the HOA, it's going to stir a hornet's nest." "Sheriff," I said quietly, "that nest already stung me." He gave a slow nod. "All right. I'll file it as a criminal investigation. But keep your head down. Folks like Bethany don't fight fair." As he turned to leave, he stopped and looked back. "One more thing. We found something near the road, dropped in the mud," he handed me a small flash drive in a clear evidence bag. On it, written in black marker, were the words, "HOA Karen 2021. "Wasn't mine," McKay said. "Found it by a tire track headed your way." My pulse quickened. "Who dropped it?" "Don't know yet. But my deputy saw a white sedan idling by the turnoff last night. Maybe your HOA friend's messenger boy." I stared at the drive. The words burned into the plastic like a dare. That night, after the fire crews were gone and the crowd had faded back to their homes, I sat inside the cabin with the flash drive in my hand. Rain started again, tapping the windows with a slow rhythm. I plugged it into my old laptop. The screen flickered, then filled with a list of PDF files and images, scanned documents, bank records, meeting minutes. Some bore the HOA logo, others private email headers. I clicked the first one. It was a ledger, monthly expenses, but buried between maintenance fees and legal retainer were payments to entities I'd never heard of. Golden Pine Consulting, Lakeview Legal, North Horizon Management. The same amounts, repeated every month. Sarah's voice rang in my memory. "Follow the money." Then I opened a folder marked Receipts. Inside were scanned copies of checks, Bethany's signature on every one. And one memo line read, "Survey alteration compensation." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. My breath fogged the glass behind me. "You cooked the books," I whispered. Another file deeper in the folder was a scanned map, identical to the forged one the HOA had sent me, except this one had a watermark. Property transfer draft, confidential, Golden Pine Developments. So it wasn't just the HOA. Developers were behind it. Bethany was their puppet, maybe even their partner. I copied everything onto a clean drive and sealed it in a plastic bag. Then, without thinking, I opened my phone camera and recorded the whole folder, scrolling slowly, timestamp visible. Proof on proof. I sent it to Sarah and added a message. "If they burn the rest, I'll still have the truth." An hour later, she replied, "We can use this. Sit tight. I'll contact a journalist friend, someone who can help us bring this public." I stared out the window toward the lake. The reflection of the flames still haunted the water's surface, red and restless. But behind that glow was something steadier, a line of fence posts, black and silent, standing guard. They couldn't erase fire damage with ink. They couldn't move boundaries drawn in truth. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to close my eyes. The storm outside rolled on, thunder deep and distant. Somewhere, justice was stirring. Slow, heavy, unstoppable. Morning came bright and cold. The kind of Montana morning that made the world smell like wet pine and iron. The lake steamed in ribbons. The boathouse was gone, reduced to a silhouette of scorched beams jutting from the shallows like broken ribs. But I didn't feel beaten. I felt awake. Sarah called at sunrise. "Jake, you sitting down?" "I'm standing," I said, staring at the fence posts glinting with dew. "Well, stand tall then. The state just assigned a temporary receiver to the HOA, some guy named Mr. Holt. They're sending him in to audit the entire operation. You rattled the right cages." "Receiver?" I repeated. "That means they're under investigation." "Exactly. It's a cleanup move," she said. "But be careful. Receivers don't always work for justice. They work for whoever holds the pen." By noon, the first black SUV rolled through the gate, shiny and bureaucratic. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been pressed from a mold labeled authority. Black suit, silver tie, clipboard clutched like a sword. "Mr. Morrison?" he asked, voice smooth as polished steel. "I'm Thomas Holt, appointed receiver for Lakeview HOA affairs. I'll be reviewing all active disputes, including yours." I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Review away. Start with the part where your predecessors tried to erase my name off the map." He didn't smile. "I'm here to restore order, not to debate grievances. You'll receive official correspondence by week's end." Then he turned and walked straight to the HOA office like it already belonged to him. By evening, word had spread around the lake. Some neighbors cheered the intervention. Others, the ones who'd benefited from Bethany's power, whispered about outsiders meddling in private affairs. But I knew better. When government men in black suits show up at a small-town lake, it's never just about order. It's about control. That night, as the sun bled out over the ridgeline, I stood by the fence and watched Holt's SUV parked outside the HOA building, headlights reflecting off my steel posts. The man stayed late, lights burning in the office window. I thought about my father again, how he built this cabin not for profit, but peace. "Every line you draw should mean something," he'd said once. "Otherwise, it's just ink." The next morning, the sheriff stopped by. He looked uneasy. "Holt's been asking about you," McKay said. "Wants to review your property deeds himself. Says the state needs confirmation." "He can have a copy," I said, "but the original stays with me." McKay nodded slowly. "Good call. Just watch your back, Jake. Folks like him don't play by county rules." That afternoon, I saw Bethany for the first time since the fire. She was standing outside the office, pale and tight-jawed, arguing with Holt. Even from a distance, I could hear her voice breaking. "You can't just take over my organization." Holt's reply was calm but sharp. "It's not yours anymore, Ms. Whitfield. You abused fiduciary trust. My team will handle the rest." She stormed off, heels stabbing the gravel, and caught sight of me leaning on the fence. For a second, our eyes met. Hers burning, mine steady. She didn't say a word, just spat into the dirt and drove away. By evening, the air felt too quiet. No frogs. No wind. Just that heavy stillness before another storm, the kind that comes from people, not weather. I called Sarah. "This Holt guy doesn't sit right." "I ran his name," she said. "Used to work for a development firm out of Billings. Golden Pine Developments. Sound familiar?" My grip tightened on the phone. The same company on the fake invoices. Bingo, she said. He's not cleaning house, he's taking it over. I looked down the long stretch of fence, black and gleaming under the last light. Every post stood like a soldier waiting for orders, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. By dawn the next day, the same work crew that helped me before rolled in. 3 good men with calloused hands and no questions. I handed them a fresh blueprint I'd drawn through the night. We're expanding, I said, straight past the old property line. I want the fence to wrap around that HOA building, every inch of it. The foreman raised a brow. You serious, Jake? That'll box in their driveway. That's the point. He shrugged. All right then, let's make it straight. By noon, the sound of drills and post drivers echoed through the valley. Sparks flew as metal met rock. Curious neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering. When the crew bolted the final panels together, the black gate clanged shut with a heavy finality. The HOA headquarters, Mr. Holt's shiny SUV and all, was now fenced inside my property. At exactly 3 o'clock, Holt stormed out, his tie askew, sweat gleaming at his temples. Mr. Morrison, this is a violation of state authority. I rested my arms on the top rail. Funny, that's what I said, when your friends violated mine. He gripped the gate, rattling it uselessly. You can't imprison a government officer. You're not imprisoned, I said. You're trespassing. That gate closes on my land according to the 1982 deed, still legally active. You want out, you file a release of entry with the county. He stared at me, jaw clenched, realizing every camera in the crowd was recording. One of the neighbors shouted, "Looks like the HOA's under new management now." Laughter rippled through the onlookers. Holt's face reddened. This is not over. Oh, I sure hope not, I said, stepping closer to the gate. Because next time, I'll be the one filing paperwork. That night, the footage made the local news. Retired engineer fences. In state receiver, calls it boundary reinforcement. Reporters parked by the highway, interviewing neighbors, replaying clips of Holt pacing inside the fenced yard like a trapped official. The story spread fast. Small-town justice in a world that had forgotten what boundaries meant. When the sun went down, I sat on my porch with a glass of cold coffee, watching the reflections of headlights flicker across the water. The lake looked calm again, but beneath its still surface the current had shifted. The fence was no longer just a line of steel. It was a statement. And somewhere out there, someone powerful had just realized they'd picked the wrong lake, the wrong man, and the wrong set of boundaries to cross. The following morning broke clear and bright, the kind of crisp Montana day that could make even the ugliest fight look beautiful. Mist rose off the lake like smoke from a cooling forge. The fence gleamed black in the sun. Perfect lines, clean corners, all of it silent testimony. But my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First came a message from Sarah. Turn on Channel 8. Now. I did. On the screen was a headline that froze me in place. State receiver under fire for conflict of interest. The broadcast showed footage from the day before. Holt shouting behind my fence, neighbors filming, the crowd cheering. The reporter's voice was calm but cutting. Sources have leaked internal emails showing Mr. Thomas Holt received consulting payments from Golden Pine Developments, the same company tied to fraudulent HOA land transfers. They showed his face, then mine, then Bethany's mugshot as she was escorted into the county courthouse. Bethany Whitfield, former president of the Lakeview HOA, was arrested this morning for embezzlement, document forgery, and obstruction of justice, the anchor said. Investigators believe she conspired with private developers to seize lakefront property through falsified deeds. The camera zoomed in on the courthouse steps, where Janet McBride, a journalist I hadn't met yet, was speaking to the press. A retired engineer named Jake Morrison first uncovered the fraudulent filings, she said. His evidence helped initiate a state audit that's now expanding across 3 counties. I stared at the screen, stunned. Sarah called. You watching? I am. You did it, Jake. The floodgates are open. They're coming down. Bethany's really in custody? Booked an hour ago. Holt's been suspended pending investigation. The governor's office is calling it a serious breach of public trust. Outside, a group of neighbors had gathered by the road, pointing at the news van parked near the fence. A camera crew set up a tripod, adjusting their angles for the perfect shot of the infamous Black Gate. I stepped out onto the porch. The reporter, a young man with an easy smile, waved. Mr. Morrison, mind saying a few words for the evening segment? I wasn't sure what to say. After months of silence, deceit, and flames, the truth had come roaring into daylight faster than I could process. I just built a fence, I told him. Turns out the truth doesn't like being fenced in. That line must have landed, because it made the 6 o'clock broadcast almost word for word. By mid-afternoon, the county sheriff himself came by. McKay looked different this time, less tired, a little lighter in the shoulders. Thought you'd want to know, he said. The state police took Holt out in cuffs, found a burner phone in his briefcase, full of messages from a Golden Pine exec promising a bonus for each parcel cleared. I exhaled slowly. So it's really over. He smiled, faintly. Maybe the storm's passed. But keep that paperwork safe, Jake. Folks like him have long memories. He tipped his hat and drove off, leaving a trail of dust curling over the road. That evening, Janet herself showed up, a petite woman in her 40s with silver streaks in her hair and the kind of sharp eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself on the porch, shaking my hand firmly. I wanted to thank you, she said. Not just for speaking up, but for keeping the evidence intact. Without those files, this would have been buried under politics. Sometimes all it takes is one line in the dirt, I said. She smiled. That line's national now. I'm airing a full expose tomorrow night. The man who fenced the HOA. It's already trending. I chuckled, but part of me winced. Never wanted fame, Janet. Just peace. Funny thing about justice, she said. It tends to be loud before it gets quiet again. As the sun went down, I sat by the lake, the air cooling, the world finally slowing to match my breath. Across the water, the burned-out frame of the boathouse cast long shadows. It was strange. Where ruin had once stood, now I felt clarity. Every board lost to flame had stripped away something false. The phone buzzed again. A new message from Sarah. Governor's office issued a statement. You're invited to testify at the ethics hearing next month. They want you on record. I smiled. Tell them I'll bring the original deed, I texted back. She replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. The next morning, I woke to the sound of laughter. Real laughter. Through the kitchen window, I saw neighbors gathered along the fence line, kids chasing each other, adults shaking hands. Someone had hung a sign on the gate. Community belongs to the people again. For the first time in a long time, the lake didn't feel divided. Later that day, a small envelope arrived by courier. Official state seal, neat handwriting. Inside was a brief note. Mr. Morrison, the court recognizes your property rights as reaffirmed by county title. The HOA charter has been dissolved. Thank you for your vigilance and service to the community. At the bottom, stamped and signed, was the seal of Judge Ramirez. I walked down to the dock, what was left of it, and let the paper rest on the weathered planks. The wind lifted one corner, and I caught it before it blew away. All around me the lake rippled with soft morning light, carrying the scent of pine and promise. Behind me the steel fence stood strong, a monument not to division, but to boundaries defended with patience, evidence, and truth. For months, I'd been the man fighting to hold what was his. Now, standing there, I realized something else. The land didn't belong to me. I belonged to it. The morning light rippled across the lake like new skin. The fence gleamed dark and sure, its reflection a perfect twin on the water. The chaos was gone. No sirens, no shouting, no meetings behind closed doors. Just wind in the reeds, the creak of the dock, and the low hum of life returning. A pickup rumbled up the drive. I knew the sound before I saw it. Travis Whitfield's old Ford, rattling like it might shake apart at any moment. He stepped out slowly, hands buried in his jacket pockets, looking smaller than I remembered. His hair was cut short, his eyes clearer. He didn't speak right away. Just looked at the lake, the burned patch where my boathouse had been, and the rebuilt dock rising beside it, half finished, half hopeful. "You rebuilt it," he said finally. "Started to," I answered. "Didn't feel right leaving it as a grave." He nodded, his gaze heavy. "I owe you something." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it over. Inside was a handwritten note. "For the tree I cut without asking. For the porch swing I sat on like I owned it. For the damage I didn't cause but also didn't stop." Taped below the note was a check for $1,000. I looked at him, unsure what to say. "I'm not my mom," he said softly. "Didn't realize what she was doing until it was too late. The money doesn't fix it, I know. But maybe it's a start." I folded the note back carefully, slid it into my shirt pocket. "You want to help fix what she broke? Bring your hammer next time." He gave a small smile, nodded once, and walked toward his truck. By noon, half a dozen neighbors had shown up, unasked. Ernest brought nails, Martha brought sandwiches, and even old Miss Nancy from the East Cabins came rolling in with lemonade. Nobody said much. They just started working. Boards thudded into place, hammers clinked like soft applause. The sound carried across the water, bright and human. When the new frame stood solid and tall, I hung the restored photograph of my father and me in the same spot where it had burned. Sarah stopped by that afternoon, hair wind-tossed, holding a letter. "Judge Ramirez signed it," she said, passing it to me. "The state dissolved the HOA. Lakeview's officially free." I ran a thumb over the embossed seal, the ink still smelling faintly of courthouse air. "Free," I repeated. It sounded like the first real breath I'd taken all year. Sarah leaned against the porch post, smiling. "They're forming a new council, a community one. People want you to lead it." I shook my head. "I'm no politician." "Neither was your dad," she said. "But he kept this lake honest. Maybe that's all they need." I looked at the water, at the rebuilt dock, the laughter echoing from the workers, the steady hum of saws. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but not for long. I've got fences to mend." She laughed. "Figured you'd say that." When she left, the evening settled in soft and gold. I took a small wooden sign I'd carved the night before and nailed it to the post beside the porch swing. The letters burned deep into the grain read, "Respect is the strongest boundary," the same phrase my father used to say every time he finished a project. Every line drawn in honesty, every fence raised in peace. The air cooled as the sun dropped, turning the lake to liquid amber. I sat on the porch with my boots up, the sound of crickets rising like distant applause. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was defending something. I felt like I was part of it. Somewhere down the road, the state workers were dismantling the old HOA sign, white letters cracking, fading in the dusk. When it fell, the echo drifted over the water like a closing chapter. I thought about all the battles, the meetings, the forged maps and flames, all the noise it took for the truth to finally be heard. Now, the quiet was a reward. The stars came out one by one, reflected perfectly in the calm lake. I lifted my cup of coffee toward the horizon, to my father, to every neighbor who'd stood their ground. "They built walls for control," I whispered. "I built mine for peace." And when the wind shifted, carrying the scent of cedar and cool water, it felt like the land itself answered back. If you've ever stood your ground for what's right, you know how it feels when truth finally wins. Drop a justice in the comments if you've ever dealt with an HOA or fought to protect your land. Out here, fences don't just mark property, they mark courage. And if you'd like to ride along for more true grit stories of land, law, and quiet revenge, hit subscribe and stay with us by the lake.